Welcome to another edition of Anglican Unscripted. This is episode 258, the Transparency Edition. I'm Kevin Carlson.
I'm Jeff Walton, and it's November 16th, 2016.
Okay, for a lot of you, Jeff is not a new face to the program. He's a writer, blogger extraordinaire, and he writes about the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church. Where do you work, Jeff?
Hi, I'm at the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., where I serve as the communications manager and as the Anglican program director.
Okay, so of course you would talk about these things. You're also located in what we call Political Central in Virginia, D.C. You've had quite a crazy week there.
Yeah, with the election last week, there's been a lot of interesting turmoil and conversation, and everybody in the Beltway has an opinion, of course, on that. So that's been a real source of conversation and, in some cases, consternation. Mm-hmm. And then there's also been a lot of good Anglican things going on, some neat activity in that realm. Two different dioceses are having their synods this month in the D.C. area, one of which is my own diocese, the Mid-Atlantic, and the other is the Diocese of Christ Our Hope, which met last week in McLean. And that's a group of congregations that were formerly under the care of the Anglican Church of Rwanda and organized themselves as an ACNA diocese. So there's a good amount of church activity going on in our area and some interesting news popping up.
Now, you're on the program today because we've had some off-camera conversations about kind of the parallels between church growth and church decline via location. I live in the Northeast here in Connecticut, Milford, but my church is up in Litchfield, the Watertown area, and we can't grow no matter what we do. We could pay people to come to church, the church would still not grow. And a lot of that we see throughout every denomination here in the Northeast. There's denominations that come in, they'll plant a church, it'll fail. They'll plant another church or rebirth the church or do whatever they want, but they struggle. The largest churches in Waterbury, Watertown, and kind of the middle of Connecticut are churches who exploded with the modern worship and lights and sounds and whistles, but they didn't grow with new members. They brought in members from other churches who were, unsatisfied with what was happening at their church on Sunday. So a lot of it was just stealing, what we call sheep stealing. Mm-hmm. And I kind of want to talk to you about this parallel of location. Why do churches here in the Northeast struggle so much?
Well, this is actually something I had conversation with last week at one of these diocesan synods. I was talking to some church planters that are in the New England area and sort of asking what the lay of the land was. I talked to one group of people who are from the city of Boston itself, and they seem to be doing pretty well. They were a congregation that was made up of a lot of people who are new arrivals to the Boston area that came for education, healthcare, insurance, finance, things like that. And their congregation now had two different worship locations at two different times. So they seem to be developing a critical mass and having success. At the same time, those that are trying to do church planting just outside of Boston, and I mean literally just a stone's throw, the closest in suburbs, were really struggling. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that seemed to have to do with the differences in population. People who had been there for a while were not interested in a new church plant. But people who were newly arrived were very much interested in a church plant. So even within a geographic region, you can have widely varying results based on what that town's population is like and what it's looking for. So in Virginia, there's been a lot of good church planting growth. I know that the Falls Church Anglican just had a gathering this past week of John Yates, the rector of the Falls Church, had all of the pastors of the Falls Church's daughter congregations come over and just have a day retreat. And there are a number of congregations that have been successfully planted. They're all a little bit different, but one of the things they have in common seems to be that they are successful in ministering to people who are relatively new arrivals to a region of the country that is highly transient and fast growing. I think if you move to these same skilled, talented church planters to some other parts of the country, they would have a differing result. So that's geography does play an advantage.
It does. In fact, geography trumps gospel. I was told early on that, and we saw this to a little bit of extent, when the ACNA was formed, they're going to plant many churches, and because they're able to replace a bad or ineffective gospel of the Episcopal Church, they'll see lots of places where they plant churches, even when there is no Episcopal Church, and they will grow instantly. And we've seen, the same type of struggles with the Lutheran Church or the Methodist Church. It's not really a zero-sum game where you're replacing a bad gospel with a good gospel, and boy, you got church.
Yeah.
Basically, where there's abundant, strong Episcopal churches, Methodist churches, Lutheran churches, there's going to be an abundant Anglican church.
Yeah, and the areas that I like to compare this to are looking geographically at where ACNA is doing well and where it's not present, and where the Episcopal Church is in steep decline, and conversely where it's holding its numbers. And there's definitely not a zero-sum relationship there. In the areas where ACNA has been taking root and has met with success, these areas are the Carolinas, DC metropolitan area, especially in Virginia, Texas, some parts of California. These areas have done pretty well, and at the same time, the Episcopal Church in those regions is generally holding its own numbers. It might be in slight decline, but it's not in collapse. Mm-hmm. Now, if we look at the areas of the country where the Episcopal Church is in free fall, areas like Rhode Island, the upper Midwest dioceses like Northern Michigan, high desert places like Eastern Oregon, those are dioceses that have lost close to 40% of their attendance in the last 10 years. And yet there is little to no ACNA presence in those places, sometimes for hundreds of miles. So
it's not just the ACNA. There's no new Methodist, there's no new Lutheran, there's no mainline denomination church plants whatsoever.
Yeah, and that is a consistent pattern where what happens with church planting usually is there's a rising tide that lifts all ships. Mm-hmm. And those areas that have good church planting activity from one denominational tradition tend to also see that success mirrored in other traditions as well in the same geographic location. So, for example, in the inner core of DC and its close-in suburbs right now, there's a lot of population growth and a lot of new churches as a result. And I can tell you that there's probably at least 40 new churches in the last decade that have taken off and have had a solid foundation built in this close-in part of the area. Mm-hmm. Whereas we don't see that in a lot of other areas of the country. So a lot of this is actually similar to what happened in the 70s and 80s in the suburbs. What happened was as population moved farther and farther out, church planters would follow. They would open up churches, open the doors, and people would walk in. And that moved back to the urban cores in the late 90s. But if you don't have that kind of population growth and that kind of transience, it can be very difficult to go and set up shop. And that is a bit of a challenge because obviously in the Anglican Church, the goal is to reach North America with the gospel of Jesus Christ, not just specific cool areas like college towns.
Well, and they've had a lot of success now with Spanish-speaking congregations, and the ACNA is obviously discovering ways around this. Because I go to a lot of small towns and I see the storefront churches, oh boy, are they going to be there in a couple of years? what's going on there, that type of thing.
Yeah, this is one of the things that's going to be a cultural challenge for ACNA, which is effectively coming from an Episcopal Church culture. I know that there's a separation that's taking place within the denomination, but culturally, there's still certain things that are assumed that come with that. And part of it is that the Episcopal Church traditionally was located in county seats and large towns, but it didn't have a presence in small rural communities or outlying areas. So that's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to reconsider as a denomination, is where have we historically not been, even when we were within the Episcopal Church. An example I would cite of this, of someone thinking thoughtfully about this, is the Anglican priest Tish Harrison Warren, who was with InterVarsity, and I believe she's doing ministry in Texas now. And she did a fantastic article in Christianity Today that appeared in the last couple months, in which she talked about the need for churches, evangelical churches to be specific, to reach out to people in rural areas. And the idea was that evangelicals have heavily focused on this idea of, capturing the city for Christ and going to areas that are sort of cultural lead points. And they haven't thought about, well, who's sort of downriver. And there was a basic point where she said that she needed to repent of sort of this decision to go and do ministry in areas that were seen as trendy, and instead had to think about where were the areas that Jesus was going during his ministry, which sometimes were out of the way, what we would perceive now as backwaters. And that is something that's going to be a challenge. But at the same time, I also want to have a real positive note, too. And that is that successful ministry often happens in surprising, unexpected ways. Certainly some of the dioceses in the ACNA have been very successful at reaching out to refugee communities. I'm thinking like the Karen from Burma and
Quincy, sure.
Yeah, these are groups that there seem to have been a good connection and a good desire to do ministry among. So often within ACNA, there's a sense that there are some dioceses that are really kind of taking the lead on church planting. And it's true, there are some that are really putting themselves out there to plant churches. But there are also dioceses that we don't necessarily think about when we hear the word church planting that are actually doing some pretty innovative stuff. Like Quincy, for example, has, they've set up congregations in Mexico. They've been doing ministry among some people groups that my diocese would love to be able to connect with. So it is really interesting to see that God often has surprises, and there are lots of open doors that the Holy Spirit has in store for us that we're not anticipating.
It might be helpful if we put this in a bigger context. A lot of people just assume that at one point, 100% of Americans went to church. And that over time we just dwindled and dwindled and dwindled until we've come to the pagan 21st century. And when the first Puritans got off the boat, we had 100% participation, and now we deserve it. We've lost our sight on God. Actually, the trend is about even.
Yes, and in fact, your viewers might find this interesting. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which compiles some really invaluable data on religious participation in the United States, has found that religious participation now is approximately, as far as Christian participation, is about a quarter of the population. That means a quarter of people are connected in some way to a church that they are involved in over the course of the year. So that is actually at a pretty good point in the life of the church. Now, it is true that in the 1950s, there was a spike in the post-war years in church participation, and we are not at the level that we were in the 1950s. But the 1950s were not reflective of the majority of the 20th century, and they weren't certainly not reflective of the United States history as a whole. An example I'd point out was that in George Washington's time, only about 10% of the American population were churchgoers. A lot of people don't realize it, but Unitarian Universalism was spreading at that point in time. And there was also a lot of dissatisfaction with the Church of England, and people were just not in church in large numbers. It wasn't until the Great Awakenings came along that you started getting movements like Methodist movement and others that really started capturing people's attention and getting them to go to church. So the rate of church attendance that we have now in the early 21st century is actually about what it was in the early 1940s.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, so this idea that, oh, well, people don't go to church anymore, well, actually, we're at a higher point of church participation than we were in many points in American history.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do want to thank you for your time. You're a busy person. You're in the political central. I imagine now you're going to drive down streets and see lots of for sale signs. Transitions in politics are unique on many different levels. Yes, you need to pick the cabinet. You need to do all these political things. But when it gets down to it, we're watching a migration of one party into a town and another party out of a town. To a certain extent, some people, many people still keep their jobs and stuff like that. But have you seen this transition before?
Yeah, I mean, when there's a new administration that comes in, especially when you have a change in political party, there are at least 4,000 positions that are senior level administration positions that have to be changed out. So that is going to affect the town, and you will see a lot of differences. There isn't a change in the control of Congress, so there won't be as much, because there's a lot more people who work on Capitol Hill than work at the White House. But it will be interesting to see these changes, and you're going to see some differences in tone because of the new people coming to town.
That's true. We may not see an IRS in the future to the extent we have now. I shouldn't mention that because I've been audited 4 times, but of all the organizations I see little need for, it would be the IRS. Thank you again, Jeff, for your time. I'm Kevin Carlson.
I'm Jeff Walton.
And you've been watching Anglican Unscripted episode 258.